Hello, this is Philosophical Rebellion. I want to talk about everything that you need to know about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because right now there is a genocide going on, and many people are supporting a genocidal terrorist state led by religious fundamentalists who are trying to ethnically cleanse a territory because they believe that their God granted them the right to take it over. So they are starving a population to death in order to do it. There's a lot of stuff going on right now with Greta Thunberg and the Freedom Flotilla Coalition, as well as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and the distribution of humanitarian aid in Gaza being used to draw in a bunch of civilians in order to shoot at them, with near daily massacres at humanitarian aid distribution sites. Not to mention that there is a man-made famine with nearly 2 million people, including many children, denied food, water, medicine, and electricity. And many people have already starved to death, and nearly the entire population is on the brink of starvation, with Benjamin Netanyahu having an International Criminal Court arrest warrant for starvation. And all of that is happening right now. But I think it is very important to go back to the beginning. And many people think that the idea of Israel was a response to the Holocaust, in which Nazi Germany exterminated millions of Jewish people in Europe. So a bunch of European nations decided that the solution was to displace Palestinians and give the Jewish population in Europe who were victims of the Holocaust a new homeland in Palestine. But that's actually not the birthplace of Israel. The state of Israel was actually a dream of the founder of Zionism who lived in the late 1800s, and he called for a Jewish settler colonial movement to occupy Palestinian territory, displace the Palestinians off of that land, and take it over for a specifically Jewish state. And that process was underway well before the Holocaust and World War II. After World War II, that religious movement was the benefactor of the Western consciousness being shocked by the Holocaust and not knowing how to rectify the situation. They were able to fill the void. There was a settler colonial movement that was able to seize the moment when it came to World War II and the Holocaust to get the entire Western world on their side, thinking that it was a moral obligation to stand up for Jewish people to support a Jewish state established in the Middle East, where they believe God granted them territory. Unfortunately, that has also been paired in the United States with a religious movement of evangelical Christians who overwhelmingly support the Jewish state of Israel because they believe that Armageddon is coming, and in order for Jesus to come back to earth, the Jews must occupy that territory. So Zionism is a religious fundamentalist movement in which they believe they are entitled to commit genocide because their God granted them territory, as well as granted them the right to take it by any means necessary. So out of World War II became the UN partition plan, which Palestinians opposed, and they fought back and they lost. And then in the 1960s, it culminated in a war, and the outcome of that was a new border proposition, but neither side accepted the terms. Palestinians disagreed that Israel should have been granted as much territory as they were, and Israelis were still wanting their idea of Greater Israel. Then, after the 1960s, the Israeli government was able to become the sole governing authority in both Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And the Israeli government maintained total control over the entire area through various levels of occupation. And the Israeli military became one of the most well-equipped fighting forces in the entire world. Then in the 90s, there was some progress towards actually creating a two-state solution, and that was known as the Oslo Accords, which was being negotiated by an Israeli prime minister named Yitzhak Rabin. But just for engaging with Palestinians as humans with rights, the Israeli religious fundamentalist movement went berserk. And religious extremists like Benjamin Netanyahu vilified Rabin so much that it eventually led to his assassination. And there's a very interesting question that was asked of the widow of Rabin if she blames Netanyahu. She essentially says yes. So I'll link below a PBS Frontline episode called Road to War about Benjamin Netanyahu's rise to power. He has been totally opposed to Palestinian human rights and the two-state solution throughout his entire career. And he came to power promising to put an end to the idea of a Palestinian state. In the early 2000s, he was actually caught saying that he put an end to the Oslo Accords. And Benjamin Netanyahu has been playing the world like a fiddle for the last 20 years to get what he wants. And what he wants is Jewish-Israeli control of the entire territory from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. He believes that Jewish Israelis should be entitled to the entire territory from the river to the sea, and that he is entitled by God to commit genocide in order to take it. And right now that is exactly what he is doing. And even with an International Criminal Court arrest warrant for his crimes against humanity and war crimes, the world is just standing by and letting him do it. Matter of fact, Donald Trump is partnered with him and is posting about the Riviera of the Middle East he is going to build over the corpses of the Palestinians that he helped to kill. Anyway, Benjamin Netanyahu helped to fund groups like Hamas because he wanted Palestinian leadership to be as violent as possible in order for him to be able to use the talking point that he has no partner for peace. So he actually helped to send billions of dollars to Hamas in order to prop them up. A little bit more of the history real quick. There were Jewish-Israeli settlements in Gaza prior to 2005. Then Israeli settlers withdrew from those illegal settlements in 2005. But that did not mean that the Israeli occupation ended. The United Nations actually documented in 2007 that Israel enacted an air, land, and sea blockade of Gaza, and that blockade remains in effect today. And under Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership, the Israeli government was found guilty of the crime against humanity of apartheid by the United Nations Office of Human Rights, by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, by the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, as well as by numerous Palestinian and Arab human rights groups, making it a well-established fact that Israel was an apartheid state, and that was the consensus of the leading human rights experts in the world by 2022. And throughout that time, the Palestinians had been trying to get the world to speak up on their behalf, and they had launched the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction movement to ask the world to help them peacefully protest against Israeli apartheid. The Palestinian people asked the world to use a similar strategy to dismantle Israeli apartheid as was used against South African apartheid. But the world ignored them, and the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction movement was a failure. So, just like John F. Kennedy said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. So it was clear that Palestinian resistance was on the brink of turning violent against the Israeli occupation. And the United Nations actually published a report specifically stating that the belligerent Israeli occupation was the main cause of recurring cycles of violence, and that Israeli impunity in their crimes against humanity was causing increasing resentment amongst the Palestinian people. It was extremely clear that violence was about to erupt. So in early 2023, I began writing to the Joe Biden administration asking him to investigate the many human rights organizations reporting on Israeli apartheid and to apply anti-apartheid stipulations on United States aid to Israel. I wrote a paper called Rethinking America's Relationship with Israel in the summer of 2023 asking Joe Biden to do just that. I was also advocating for Palestinians to continue pursuing nonviolent resistance, and I was accused of ignoring the human rights of Palestinians and asking them to treat their oppressors with respect when they were not being respected themselves. And of course that made a lot of sense to me, because any people living in the situation the Palestinians were living in would hate the Israelis. If Jewish Israelis were living in the situation they forced Palestinians to live in, they would hate themselves too. So then October 7th happened, and there's a lot to get into there. Because it is one of the days where the facts and reality of the situation have been so heavily distorted that it is the center of a lot of modern propaganda justifying Israel's genocide. So getting back to something I said earlier, Israel has one of the most advanced militaries in the world, with one of the most well-equipped intelligence agencies with extreme spying capabilities. And that gave them very good knowledge of everything that Hamas and other Palestinian groups within occupied territory were doing. So 1 year before the October 7th attack, Hamas had actually created a battle plan, and Israel had possessed it for the entire year. And it was later reported that Hamas had followed that plan with a shocking level of precision. So Israel knew exactly what Hamas was going to do with everything they needed to prevent it, except for the date that it was going to happen. So then fast forward to September 2023. Benjamin Netanyahu gave a speech at the United Nations in which he presented a new map of the Middle East. He actually called it the New Middle East. And it depicted Israel in control of the entire territory from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, with no mention of Palestine. So Benjamin Netanyahu presented his map at the United Nations, and at the same time, September 2023, Israel was already enacting a bombing campaign inside of Gaza, as well as their long-term apartheid occupation. So there was absolutely no peace for Palestinians living under Israeli apartheid or Israeli bombardment prior to October 7th. And it was clear that because of Israel's belligerent apartheid occupation, there was a growing resistance among the Palestinian population. So many other governments had been monitoring the situation. And about 10 days before October 7th, the United States warned the Israeli government of an imminent attack. The Israeli government was also warned by the Egyptian government of an imminent attack from within Gaza. That was also within a few days before the attack. With all of this knowledge and a detailed Hamas battle plan, the Israeli government moved troops away from the southern border, their border with Gaza, to the West Bank, where they needed the troops for illegal Israeli settlement expansion, leaving their southern border undefended. And that troop redeployment was actually opposed by on-the-ground commanders in the Israeli military, in their Gaza division, but those concerns were superseded by higher-ups in the Israeli military. And this is really the cherry on top of it all. The Israeli intelligence agency, the Shin Bet, had operatives within Gaza warning of a mass mobilization the day before the attack, as well as many warnings preceding that about Hamas practicing the battle plans that they had been writing about for an entire year. So the Israeli Shin Bet reported that to their leaders the day before the attack. So on October 6th, the Israeli military knew everything they needed to know to prevent the attack. And instead of doing that, they delayed and delayed and delayed. So I think it's very important to question the motives of why the attack wasn't stopped in the first place. But then we need to get into the October 7th attack and the details of it. Because if you believe the Israeli narrative, then you think that Hamas specifically attacked civilians and used rape as a weapon of war in order to inflict maximum psychological damage of Jewish Israelis, who they were attacking out of a vicious racism and anti-Semitism. But that is not true. Hamas claims to have attacked IDF Gaza military installations, to have not used rape as a weapon of war, to have ordered their soldiers not to attack civilians, although they do admit that some of their militants got overwhelmed in the fog of war and killed many civilians, which they admit are war crimes, and they claimed to have held those individuals accountable. Hamas claims the primary cause of civilian death on October 7th was Israeli friendly fire, mainly from Apache helicopters at the Nova Music Festival and from tanks firing on Israeli civilians in their own homes. There's also the issue that other Palestinian resistance groups broke into Israel and also committed war crimes that Hamas is being blamed for. But let's get into the friendly fire statistics real quick, because I've had some very interesting questions for the AI on Elon Musk's X platform. The AI is called Grok. And I asked Grok to create a rough estimate of the amount of civilian casualties that likely occurred on October 7th, given the fact that Israeli Air Force officers had reportedly unloaded 28 weapons payloads on the Nova Music Festival, including many civilian casualties alongside attacking Hamas militants. In addition, there are reports from Israeli military officials, as well as people who actually worked in the tank units, reporting that the tanks were firing on Israeli civilians, and they were ordered to fire on buildings that they knew had Israeli civilians in them. So there are these huge portions of friendly fire casualties that are being ignored. So I asked Grok to make an accurate fact-based analysis of that day and come up with a rough estimate of how many victims of friendly fire Israel had. And it was nearly 200, which would account for nearly 1/3 of all civilian casualties that day, which we know to be about 700 civilian casualties. In addition, Hamas had vehemently denied using rape as a weapon of war, and subsequent investigations into the many claims of rape made that day have been disproven. It was actually a religious fundamentalist movement in Israel who was going around making that claims, which the more they were investigated turned out to be unsubstantiated. So one thing we've heard many times from the Israeli government throughout their war is that it is different to attack civilians versus having some civilians caught in the crossfire of a legitimate legal attack. So I am of the belief that Hamas is entitled to human rights, including the right to self-defense. And it is a proven fact that Israel was an apartheid state illegally occupying Palestinian territory preceding October 7th. So I believe that Hamas had the legal right to enact armed resistance to fight for their own liberation. I also believe that Hamas mainly attacked military installations, with the Nova Music Festival not being a target of the attack. Which is also very interesting to talk about, because the Nova Music Festival on October 5th was not planned. There was a festival that was supposed to stop on the 6th, but it was extended another day at the last minute. So Hamas could not have even possibly planned to attack the Nova Music Festival, which was not even planned itself the day before the attack happened. But that's very interesting to consider, because think about the Shin Bet warning that there was a mass mobilization from within Gaza, following the exact trajectory that the detailed Hamas battle plans showed would happen in order to launch the October 7th attack. And the Israeli military decided to extend a music festival along their southern border while they had troops displaced in another region. Then, when the attack started, there was a mass Hannibal order given in which Israeli Apache helicopters and tanks fired indiscriminately on their own civilians alongside Hamas militants. So to me, that's about as close to a false flag event as you could get without directly orchestrating the entire thing yourself. And what I think is very interesting is that Hamas has been advocating this entire time for international investigations into what happened that day, while Israel has been obstructing and refusing to allow those investigations to happen. So think about that for a second. Who should we trust? The people who want investigations into the day, or the people who don't? So then what happened right after October 7th? Israeli religious fundamentalists said now is their time to deploy their ethnic cleansing campaign. The leader of the Israeli military announced a total siege of Gaza in order to restrict all food, water, medicine, and electricity from the territory, claiming that they were fighting human animals. And other top Israeli officials were quoted as saying that their bombing campaign had an emphasis of damage, not accuracy, which you could really witness in the effect. And in the first month of the war, October 2023, I wrote a paper called Israeli War Crimes and American Complicity. And there's a Guardian article I link in there showing before and after pictures of Gaza relative to Israel's bombing campaign. And it was just total destruction of the civilian infrastructure. Clearly no targeting of military sites. And I had actually linked in that paper of individual instances where Israel had targeted evacuation routes, designated safe zones, water desalination facilities, and all of these places that were supposed to be safe for civilians. But Israel was not targeting Hamas. The Israeli government, the entire time from October 7th, has been engaged in a genocidal campaign against all civilian life in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu even invoked the idea of Amalek, which is this evil story that says that you should kill all of the women, children, even the cattle and sheep of your opposition. Total erasure. And that is what Benjamin Netanyahu wants for Gaza. He has been planning his final solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he is enacting it right now. Genuinely, I think he wants an ethnic cleansing, where he's fine if the Palestinians just leave and never come back. But the fallback is a starvation campaign. He is already responsible for widespread starvation in Gaza. But one of the biggest impediments to their starvation campaign that the Israeli government has found is the existence of human rights organizations distributing aid. So they specifically cited the UNRWA as their biggest impediment to killing all Gazans. And they've been working out how to get rid of the human rights organizations. And their solution has been the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It is an organization founded by former Mossad and CIA officials with the explicit intent to transition all human rights aid to the foundation away from other organizations which have been doing the work, in order to have total control of all aid going into Gaza under the control of the Israeli military through its proxies. And that is exactly what is happening right now, with near daily massacres at the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation aid sites, with the Israeli Defense Force shooting indiscriminately into the crowds of starving people looking for food. So we are way past the point where the director of the World Food Program has been talking about children withering away to the size of skeletons before passing from malnutrition. That's been a daily thing for months at this point. Israel's killed dozens of children every single day over the last year and a half. And Gaza is at an inflection point. They are about to starve to death. There is a mass famine, man-made, and Benjamin Netanyahu is the one orchestrating it. And that's why he has an International Criminal Court arrest warrant for the use of starvation as a weapon of war. And over the last 18 months, the apartheid state of Israel has been found guilty of genocidal war crimes by United Nations experts, by United Nations special committees, by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, and by nearly every single well-informed, moral person on the planet. It's actually undeniable at this point that Israel is committing genocide. And that's where we find ourselves today, with Greta Thunberg and the Freedom Flotilla Coalition trying to take a little tiny sailboat into Gaza to take food to starving people. And the Israeli military illegally intercepted them in international waters and arrested human rights activists under the British flag for taking food to starving people. So this is really the easiest moral question of the 21st century. Do you support the evil motherfuckers who are trying to starve a population to death, or do you support the human rights activists who are trying to take food to starving people? Genuinely, if that's a hard question for you, you're fucked in the head. But what happened was Israel arrested the entire Freedom Flotilla Coalition crew members, who, as of this recording, are sitting in an Israeli prison, which are notorious for human rights abuses, including systemic rape of hostages. Preceding October 7th, Israel actually held thousands of Palestinian hostages in detainment. And that detainment is notorious for widespread abuses like beatings, food deprivation, extreme temperature exposures, being forced to sit in complete silence in extremely uncomfortable positions for extended periods of time, even days, and very recently, for raping Palestinian prisoners to death. There was a case where they actually caught the prison guards on camera raping a dude to death with a metal object, and that was actually widely supported in Israel. There were riots to free the prison guards who had been arrested. Israeli members of their Knesset, their government, were actually defending the rape of those Palestinian hostages. saying, and I quote, "Everything is legitimate." So right now, Greta Thunberg and human rights activists trying to feed a starving population are being held by the Israeli military. We don't know what they're being treated like, but in all reality, they're very famous Western celebrities, so they're likely to be treated well, relative to how Palestinians are treated. But not only do we need to release Greta and those human rights activists, not only does Benjamin Netanyahu need to see his day in court at the International Criminal Court for his war crimes and crimes against humanity, we also need to end the siege of Gaza. People are starving to death as we speak. Palestinians who have lived the last 18 months of Israel's genocide are facing the choice of ethnic cleansing or extermination, and the world needs to give them a third option. Israel and the United States will not accept a two-state solution. The world needs to force it on them. We are at an inflection point in world history, and we need to transition from a might makes right, they can steal the land, they can kill the people, so they're going to do it type society, to one ruled by international law and an international criminal court that actually works. And when it issues arrest warrants, they actually matter. So I think Greta Thunberg is absolutely right. If you have any humanity left, now is the time to stand in solidarity with Palestinians. Now is the time to speak up. And now is the time to call your elected representatives, no matter what country you are in, and demand that they stop supporting the Israeli government, that they stop aiding and abetting Israel's genocide of Palestinians, that they actually start working towards a two-state solution with the human rights of the Palestinian people respected.